Hello and welcome to the Clean Energy Pod, powered by SSE, your guide to the people and technologies delivering the clean energy revolution. And on today's episode, we talk about people and communities and how we can deliver for them as we move from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. We're joined by Rachel McEwen, Chief Sustainability Officer here at SSE and one of the pioneers of what is the world's first corporate just transition strategy. We'll discuss what it means for companies, for the industry, and of course, for communities. Let's get started. Rachel, thanks very much for joining us here on the Clean Energy Pod to discuss this thing called a just transition. Now, it's a nice phrase, but what the hell does it actually mean?
So, it's actually got a really big meaning. And it came from the Paris Agreement. So actually written into the text of a Paris Agreement was for the first time in climate discourse properly set out that as we are transitioning to net zero, which is basically to take all carbon out of the economy, that we need to do that in a way that is fair for workers. So it talks about, just very briefly, a little bit about this idea of a just transition for workers. And where that came from is basically from the trade union movement from decades ago, when there were almighty industrial transformations, and all of us in the developed world have seen these industrial transformations happen around us over the last decades. And in America, there were some sites where this idea of let's have a fair transition where workers can be planned. So yes, the site may need to close, but they can be planned their careers, their next steps. So that's where the idea came from. But actually, in climate terms, we've gone up a level. And if you really think about this and you think about how we're responding to climate change, there's lots of wonderful things associated with climate action. You can think of them now. You can think of new jobs, new opportunities. You think about, if you're into this sort of thing, sort of technology in your home, your car, all that stuff been pretty cool. But also things like clean air in our neighbourhood. These are what I would call climate goods. It's all the wonderful things. But of course, there is another side to the coin. And there are things that what we might call climate bads. And they tend to be around two things, either lost livelihoods, so jobs that have changed or disappeared, or it could be to do with additional costs. So the costs, the burdens on services and goods. So if you go up that level beyond jobs, it is about jobs, but it's also about a bit more than that as well. It's about the fair distribution of those climate goods and those climate bads. And it's going to take quite an almighty effort by lots of people to really think about this and make sure that we've taken actions that make the good things available to everybody, but also think quite carefully about how we distribute the bad things.
I think that's a really good way of framing it, but I don't want to move off the jobs yet. So we'll come back to the other stuff in a second, because the jobs is really important. So we're sitting here in Glasgow in Scotland. We're a few yards away from the Clyde, which used to be a big shipbuilding industry, and now there's next to nothing left of that. And that was a very painful transition. And I suppose if I was working in oil and gas at the moment, I might be thinking, gosh, my industry is still really important, but it doesn't feel that way. I hear all this good stuff about green and renewables, but does that necessarily mean that I will not have a job going forward? How should people in these so-called high carbon industries, how should they think about this transition? And is there such a thing as a just transition if you're an oil and gas engineer who loves that industry, thinks they contribute in that industry, but would like to have a 20, 30-year career?
Well, first of all, that has to be the objective here. So there has to be a sense, there has to be a mission, which is to go, yes, there has to be a future for former high carbon workers, whatever it is that they were doing. Could be oil and gas, but it could be, car mechanics. Do you know what I mean? Because the nature of the mechanical process in a vehicle is completely different. So that has to be the objective. Now, you're also right that history is littered with quite devastating effects of industrial transformations that have left scars. And in our Glasgow, across the middle of England, all sorts of places, we see that. And sometimes internationally, people will look at the example of the UK and the coal industry and the end of the coal industry through the 80s and 90s as being one of the top examples of how not to do a transition. So we've got all this for better or for worse, this experience, how can we learn from that in order to plan these transitions in a better way? So that's all great. Okay, that's the theory. The practical reality of making that is turning out to be quite tough and quite difficult. And that's when you need to sort of, I'd always talk about, eating an elephant in bite-sized chunks. So there's no way that you can eat that elephant all at once unless you start to break it down into bite-sized chunks. And amongst the actors who've got a role in this, and of course I work for SSE. We're not going to have the answer to a just transition. Of course we haven't. But can we make a little bit of a contribution? Can we help along the way? And does it matter to us? Absolutely.
Okay, explain that then. Why does it matter that there is a just transition if you're SSE? SSE's been part of that industrial change. Coal in the UK has just been phased out, but SSE used to be, producing a lot of electricity using coal. It's now transitioning more towards renewables. Why does it matter that the asset companies contribute to this? It sounds a bit like this should be a kind of government policy initiative, not something that companies are leading on. What role does private industry have in this?
So yes, government and policy should be in the lead. But so why it would matter to a company like us is because we have set our sails on the net zero transition. We are completely defined. Every economic opportunity we are facing into is because we have got to transition the power system from a high carbon one into a low carbon one. Now the power system's doing quite well. We're making a lot of progress, but we're not at zero yet. We've still got some important heavy lifting to do, but we are probably 3/4 of the way there, 2/3 of the way there. And there have been some transitions that have already happened. You've just described the fact that the UK has come out of coal generation. Now, that has occurred reasonably smoothly. And one of the things that's important to people who are sort of making the case for a just transition is this sense of an orderly transition. So a lot of the research and the work that's looked at this, what we look at is the more disorderly the transition is, the worse the impacts are for humans. And it's sort of a bit of a no-brainer in a way, but that's what you see from the past is chaotic, disorderly, completely market-led with no intervention whatsoever. Those are the things where it ends badly. Here, we've got a bit of a heads up. We know that every single sector of the economy has to transition to net zero, and power is one of the first ones that's up. So what can we do practically in little elephant bite-sized chunks in order to make a contribution to that? Now, there is another point here, and you'll have heard politicians talk about taking people with us on this journey to net zero, and that phrase is bandied about. And I think if you start to unpick that, I think what you really mean is that there is fairness as we transition for working people and for consumers and for their communities. When you start to get in, so what is your strategy for bringing people with us, then that is about is about making sure that we do this thoughtfully, carefully, but also quite quickly. So there's quite a lot to do all at once. But I don't think that's impossible.
What would a fair result look like then?
Well, so the problem with saying that, and I can say, of course, I can do lovely warm words that sound like motherhood and apple pie, which of course fairness is where the opportunities and the benefits of net zero, those climate goods, are shared fairly. Now, I can give you lots of little examples that would be examples of that happening. So, for example, that perhaps those with the least or people with fuel poverty, that they are prioritised for energy efficiency. That sounds like a bit of fairness, doesn't it? That people who are in high carbon jobs, that there is a plan and that there's some workforce planning and that there are pathways articulated and identified for them to take career choices into that sounds like fairness. But you're absolutely right. So you can go at high level and go, well, we need to make sure its benefits are shared fairly and that the burdens are also fairly distributed. But you need to get into the detail quite quickly, because otherwise it just sounds like a bit of splaff, if I'm honest. So you need to get specific. And I suppose that's what SSE has tried to do. We're trying round the edges to do some practical things. And, an example of that is we are deliberately trying to seek to attract people from high carbon industries to come and work in our low carbon industry.
Let me interrupt you for just 1 second, which is to ask for a like, a comment, or a subscribe. It's not only good for all of our egos here at SSE, but it's also really important for ensuring that this podcast gets spread as widely as possible so that people can benefit from the information that we are sharing. So please, if you can, take just 1 second to like, comment, or subscribe. Thank you. And what response are you getting from people? Because actually, one of the things I just know from personal experience, people I know who work in oil and gas, their concern is that's actually kind of a well-paid. It's not like for like. It's, there are particular things. Yes, there are sacrifices. If you're working offshore, for instance, you're very well paid for that. But you spend 6 months of your time away from your home and your family. Can renewables compete when it is a different job? I mean, the skills might be quite similar, but it's a different job. Pay levels might be different. Conditions might be different. How are you finding attracting people from these high carbon, often high paying jobs into a renewable sector that maybe doesn't match some of the financial rewards you get elsewhere?
This is a really important point. I actually had a discussion yesterday with 2 trade union leaders about exactly this point. And we do need to be realistic, because we cannot be asking people with a certain set of circumstances and conditions, life conditions, to start to work in, I don't know, care or something. It's not, we need to be realistic about where people end up in the pathways that they choose to take. You don't put people on pathways, they have to choose it. So of course it needs to be appealing. And across the whole economy, this is obviously we're focusing on oil and gas to renewables. That's the classic one. Yeah. But actually, if you look across the economy, there's lots of areas where there are skills that need to adapt or change or shift across. There is definitely evidence, and plenty of it actually, in SSE, where people are making that direct shift from oil and gas directly into SSE. They might have been high voltage engineers offshore. We've got lawyers, we've got public affairs consultants, all sorts of people work in oil and gas. You don't need to be an offshore worker. And you can see that they are voting with their feet. But there will be some people that they're not, because that's not working out for them yet. But we have got experience. What they're telling us, because we need to know, okay, that's really interesting. They chose to come. Despite what you're saying, oil and gas has, in some ways, it was almost depicted as danger money almost in the old days. So that there's a definite lifestyle associated with working offshore. And these people are choosing to come to work in transmission. Actually, it's not just renewables. And we've done quite a lot of work with them to understand why. Okay, what's your experience so far? And what could we do better to make it an easier journey for you if that's what you wanted to choose to do?
Okay, but if I'm sitting on an oil and gas platform right now and I'm thinking, you know what, I'd like to make the leap into renewables, what do you say to that person who's thinking about making the transition but is a bit nervous that it might not be for them?
The truth is I'm not going to say anything to them, because what we did was we asked the people that we've employed that came from oil and gas, we asked them exactly that question. A couple of years ago, we basically got them together, 153 of them, and that was the key last question. What would you say to somebody in oil and gas that was thinking about making the move to renewables or transmission, to power sector, really? And we've done a little report, and we've published every single thing that they said, and there's 153. We didn't edit them at all. So they're in there, warts and all. But what's in there is really interesting. And there are some really sensible, sound piece of advice. So there's things they'll say, you need to look at the whole package. You need to look at the fact that you've got your pension, and that they're quite sensible, lots of different things that they're saying to these people. But then there was really quite endearing things that just said, just go for it. If you don't try, how will you find out? So it was quite funny. It was very authentic, I think, is how you might describe it.
Great. So we've talked about jobs, because I do think lots of people do think about that, and especially given where we're speaking from, Scotland, a lot of the economy has been based on oil and gas in the past. There'll be lots of people who are seeing the energy opportunity and thinking, how do they make that leap? But the other good thing I think you said earlier on is it's sometimes the language around clean energy and the net zero transition, it's all relentlessly positive, which is often a good thing. But actually, there are potential downsides. So let's talk about some of those. You describe those climate goods and climate bads. So let's be negative for a moment and talk about some of those climate bads, because sometimes the debate that doesn't get aired as much as maybe it should do. And if you're going to be honest and open with people, there will be some sacrifices in the transition. What are the main ones from your perspective?
So the obvious first one is lost livelihoods, particularly to your point earlier, when they were high value livelihoods, and matching toe for toe those high value livelihoods. That's definitely a challenge. I would like to think that it's not impossible across the whole of the package, and where you're thinking of work-life balance, and that there are more things to life than living on a platform, but also recognise some people like that. You need to be super careful you're not judgy in all of this. I have a personal opinion that we have to be very careful to respect what went before us. So people who have worked in coal mining or coal generation or extracting oil and gas, they have been making an unbelievable contribution to our quality of life for decades.
And those skills are absolutely transferable as well. So people maybe sometimes forget that many of the exact same skills, you just change the industry.
Completely.
Actually, the individual and the skills they have are very valuable.
Skills, safety ethos, they're really important things. So that there's an important thing here about respect and not pitting working people against working people. That's very important. There are other things. So it's never easy for a community hosting nationally significant infrastructure. And one of the things with our new net zero world is that we need to have a lot of infrastructure. And of course, what we need to do there is to do that in the best way we possibly can. And I mean the collective we. I don't just mean SSE. I mean across the country. Anything that is nationally significant infrastructure, which is everything from transmission infrastructure to new big generators, but also actually water, roads, railways, all those sorts of things. These things are hard. Particularly in a place that's quite highly densely populated, which the UK generally is. Obviously, Scotland is just a wee bit different from that, but that's hard. So there's some trade-offs in there, and what we have to do is to do it the best that we possibly can. And I like to think that we're making a lot of progress there. There are other things I worry about. So I worry about the digitally enabled to be able to access so much of the benefits around tariffs and costs, and benefiting all of that will be to those who are able to access those sorts of things. And that's where public services have got to come in to make sure that people have got the capacities and the capabilities to go about that. And if they don't, then there needs to be intervention. You can even see like things like people with disabilities in electric cars. So the ability to access and to think through the charging infrastructure in a way that there's accessibility. So it's that thing about breaking it down into bite-sized chunks, and you start to get granular and quite specific. And that's where you can create action. That's where you can do things. And that's where, companies like us and many, many others, if we are all focused on, okay, it's in all our interests to do this in a way that is considered, that's thoughtful, that's smoothing the transition, then I think we could probably get somewhere.
Let me take just 1 second to interrupt you, and that is to ask for a like, comment or subscribe. It's not just about our egos. It's really about the YouTube algorithm, because if you like, comment or subscribe, then it spreads this podcast to more and more people, so they get to benefit from the information that you and I are both hearing about on the Clean Energy Pod. So let's both collectively feed the YouTube monster and help spread the message of how we deliver the clean energy transition more broadly. Now, one of the things you've been looking at is SSE is just one company, of course. There's lots of companies involved in transition, but SSE spends quite a lot of money in its supply chain. And so whereas this might be a business with, 14,000 people, whatever the exact number is, I'm not quite sure, its impact will be on many times that because of the investment in the supply chain. Have you looked at that as an opportunity to spread some of these sustainability messages? And what traction have you had with partners of SSE?
In terms of SSE's just transition work, one of the things that is really clear from our stakeholders, particularly our trade union partners, is that one of the litmus tests of whether or not we transition to net zero in a fair and just way is if there is more economic value shared with local communities and the local economies in which these assets are being hosted. And this has been a thread through not just Scotland, but through the UK, but actually you see it in other parts of the world now, is that it's almost like that communities are looking for almost like a part of the bargain. You know, this can't just be done to us. We have to be part of it too. And this notion of manufactured content is really important to these stakeholders. SSE believes it's really important too. We also know it's been tough. So for 2 decades plus, I've been watching this, and there have been false dawns. We have seen promises, maybe over promises at times of the manufactured content that may come to our shores.
Just so that people get this, so let's just pick up a bit of infrastructure. So there's a wind farm going to be built in a community, and that will generate a significant amount of value over its lifetime. But people are looking at that and going, well, where are the manufacturing jobs? Where's the community benefit from this sort of stuff? That's what we're talking about.
That's exactly
how we get
right.
that into that local community rather than the value being dispersed elsewhere.
Yes. So, and if you're looking at this through the lens of those stakeholders, so I'm sort of speaking on their behalf just now, the thing that has appeared to be the most important to them is that Scotland or the UK or local places get a larger share of that manufactured content. Now, there's trade-offs here, and this is where warts and all, so you know, truth and honesty, is that you can't, you know, we're not going to be able to have in every single part of the world, because every single part of the world wants this. You can't have a blade factory in every corner of the world. That's not economically efficient, and of course that's not good for consumers. And then if consumers are overpaying for their electricity, that's not a just transition either. So you can see it all gets a bit complicated. However, I think that we are all in violent agreement amongst us in the industry and with our trade union colleagues and others that there should be a larger share of that manufactured content coming to the UK. And the new government in Westminster, that is a priority. That's very welcome, because it isn't just whether or not a company like us says, dear OEM, which are the people who create these things, will you create a factory on our doorstep? Because of course every company like SSE is going, please create a factory on our doorstep. But if you've got lots of companies and then you've got the government coming in behind, perhaps investing in ports and harbours, the core infrastructure that's required for these places to become competitive, to build important factories, then you can put together what you might call a strategic industrial plan. Now, that's exactly where we need to get to. Now, SSE is definitely one, you know, towards the front of the pack, I would like to think, in terms of making the case for these things. We've had a bit of a success, I think, with partners and others in working with a cable manufacturer. So Sumitomo is building a factory in the Moray Firth. I also am very aware from history that sometimes these investments can be precarious. They come and then they go. So, and I like to describe it as a bit of a sugar rush to the economy, and that's quite good for a while. But actually, we need more than that. You need the ecosystem. You need the little engineering firms. You need the remanufacturing, the circularity parts of this to come along too. So it's a more healthy long-term basis and not just the hero factory for the moment. We need to do this right this time, because we know we've seen it so many times before. We really need to get it right.
And this has been a very upfront conversation, you say warts and all. And you've been doing this for a while and thinking about it for a while. And, you know, we're kind of into the hard yards in terms of whether we will get net zero or not. Given your experience, given the challenges that we've talked about, are you optimistic that we can get to something like net zero? Or are you thinking it's maybe a bit more challenging than you thought before?
So I heard a very wise woman say at a climate group event a couple of weeks ago, that wise woman was Jacinda Ardern, and she said, I won't be accused of having optimism bias, but I am happy to be accused of having an expectation bias. And that's the way I think I would like to put it as well. Generally, my personality is a half glass full kind of person. But you're looking at the facts that are in front of us, and an enormous amount of progress needs to be made in very short order. And what's happening to the climate, we can all see and feel it. We have got no choice. We have to have an expectation bias that all of us collectively get our act together and we deliver these hard yards, these megawatts, one by one, every single one of them, every inch of transmission infrastructure, because this is what's going to deliver net zero. There's nothing more strategic to delivering net zero than getting power sector down to zero.
Rachel, thank you very much for your time. And that's all we have time for in this episode of the Clean Energy Pod. If you can, please like, subscribe or share with a colleague. Lots of this information is valuable to lots of people as we all move towards delivering the clean energy transition. Thank you and goodbye.